So the next point of address is firing for these enemies. We're going to make them shoot, not necessarily at us to begin with, but eventually. So the first step towards that, we're going to just get them to fire automatically over time. And they're actually going to shoot the way they're facing. So they're always going to shoot to the right for now. And then later on, we're going to make them face certain directions to do with the waypoints, or either look at us when they've clocked us, they'll look at us and shoot at us eventually. But for now, we're just going to spawn bullets over time. We are going to need a new script for it, but we're also going to need the bullet itself. So I'm going to make what's known as a prefab. And just before I do, I'm going to make a folder for it. So I'm going to right click here and create a folder called prefabs. Then to make the prefab, to make the bullet itself, I'm going to bring the bullet sprite into the scene and just set it up. So what is it going to need? It's going to need, it's tag changing, it's going to be an enemy, it's going to kill us when it hits us, it's going to need a collider if it's going to hit us. So mine's going to have a circle collider on it. I've gone into 3D. So it's going to have a circle collider, and it's going to need a rigid body as well. So a 2D rigid body with the gravity turned off. So let's set the gravity scale to 0, and we can leave it at that. We don't have to worry about rotation and things too much with bullets. Okay, so there's our bullet. Next step, we're going to turn it into a prefab by dragging it from the hierarchy into our prefabs folder. And that now becomes a prefab. That's a reusable object that we can spawn from code. We can make our enemies spawn these prefabs over time. They're also just very handy for, if you're going to develop extra levels, it's a good idea to turn your player into a prefab, so that when you make that new level, you can just drop the prefab in instead of having to worry about setting everything up from scratch. But that's by the by. Feel free to do that if you need to. Okay, next step, we need some script. So we're actually going to make two scripts this time. The first one is going to be the actual, the brains of the shooting that we're going to put on the enemies. And the second bit of script is going to be the projectile itself. So a bit of code that's going to go on that bullet prefab. And I'm going to edit that from the prefabs folder a little bit later. So what I can actually go ahead and do is just delete the bullet from the scene. We don't need it in there, so I'm going to delete it. But it is still in that prefabs folder, so we don't have to worry about it too much. Okay, first bit of code. Let's create a C# script, and I'm going to call mine auto fire, because that's what it's going to do. I'm going to fire it up. And same process again. What do we need to know? We actually aren't going to need the start function this time around, so let's clear it out. We're pretty much always going to need update. Most classes need it, just because that's where the main behavior goes. So what do we need to know? We need to know the bullet that we're going to shoot. So the bullet itself, we need to know that. We're going to need to know how often to shoot. So let's call that rate of fire, rate off mesh link. I really should just not bother with this. Rate of fire. And we're going to, behind the scenes, need to know like the internal timer. How, if we're going to fire every 3 seconds, we need to know how close to that 3 seconds we are, basically. So let's have an internal timer. And then in terms of what we need to do, we just need to shoot. So let's go ahead and make that straight away. Let's have void shoot. There you go. And let's turn these into variables. So this bullet itself, the bullet is going to be a game object. We're going to spawn in brand new game objects. So that's going to be a public game object, and we'll call it projectile prefab. So that's going to be our bullet. Then we need a rate of fire. This is going to be a number. We'll make it public again. So public float rate of fire. And by default, let's say we're going to shoot every 2 seconds. And then our internal variable, this private variable, is going to be a float, and we'll call that shot timer. And that by default is going to be 0. So it's going to count up to our rate of fire and then reset when we've shot. There are a billion ways to do that. We don't have to count up. It might be more common to count down. But in this particular case, we're going to count up to 2 and tick back. Okay. So in terms of actually shooting, we need to create a new version of this prefab and add it to the world. So that's all that's going to happen in the shoot function. The update function this time is going to carry a bit more logic. It's debatable whether you put this logic in the shoot function itself, or if you do, just leave the shoot function purely to spawn that bullet in. You can actually move all the logic we're about to do, if you like, into the shoot function. But we're going to do the brains of it here. So this update function is going to start with a question, and we're going to say if our internal shot timer is bigger than our rate of fire. So that question means we are ready to shoot. So if our internal shot timer is bigger than the rate of fire, it means we've counted up enough that we need to spawn a bullet. So in that case, we are going to shoot. We're going to use our shoot function. And then to make sure we don't just infinitely shoot once we've ticked up this timer once, we're going to knock the timer down. So after we've shot, we're going to make shot timer equal shot timer minus rate of fire. So if our rate of fire is 3, shot timer is going to count up until it's bigger than 3, so maybe it goes to 3.1, and then we're going to knock 3 off it, so it goes back down to 0.1, and the process will start again. So if the shot timer is bigger than rate of fire, we're going to shoot. We still need the actual uptick of this timer, so if the shot timer isn't bigger than the rate of fire, so else, if it's not bigger than the rate of fire, we'll do shot timer equals shot timer plus the delta time. So every frame that we're not bigger than the shot timer, we're going to increase it. And to be fair, we could have actually not bothered with the else, but it's just a nice little look at how the structure works. We pretty much always want the shot timer to increase. Every passing moment is of value to the reload speed of this, but this little setup is quite handy. So if this is true, if this question is yes, we do this bit of code, else we do this bit of code. So if that's true, do that, otherwise do that. It's quite good just as a setup to start seeing a bit more of. So if you want to have, say you were going to do a flip of a coin, if heads do this, else tails must have been the outcome, so we would do that. It's just quite handy to be able to have that sort of reaction to a decision. Then the shoot function is dead straightforward. We just want to create a new copy of this object. So I'm going to use a function called instantiate. We're going to make an instance. When we make a copy of an object, it's called an instance. So the instantiate function creates an instance of an object. And then in brackets, we need to put the original object, and this is our projectile prefab. So we're going to put our projectile prefab in there, and we could leave it at that. If I closed it up and saved it, that would be okay, but it would make the bullet spawn in the same position every time. We actually want the bullet to spawn where the enemy is. So we're going to flesh this out a little bit. After telling it what to instantiate, we're going to do a comma, and we're not actually going to use this option. You can see here it's prompted me for a parent object. We don't want that option. You can actually use the arrow keys to move through them, and that is the one we want. So option 4 of 6 lets us specify the object we want to make a copy of. It lets us set a position, and it lets us set a rotation. And these two are dead easy. We just want to copy the position of the enemy that shot the bullet. So as this script is going on to the enemy, we can just use transform.position, and we can do a comma there and do transform.rotation. And that will just instantly copy the current position of the enemy, current rotation of the enemy, and pop them into that bullet that we've just spawned. So that is pretty much everything there. Let's just clean this comment up. And there's your code for spawning a bullet over time. Let's just save it, jump back to Unity, and pick this enemy here. Okay, so I'm going to put my autofire script onto my enemy, so it's got a couple of behaviors now, and you can see here it needs a game object to shoot, so that's where I can jump to my prefabs folder and just pop the bullet in, and that's told it which object to spawn. we've got the rate of fire, so every 2 seconds it's going to make a copy of this bullet. I'm going to hit play. 1, 2, and there we go. You can see it's dropped a bullet, and after 2 seconds it drops another one. That's great, but they don't do a right lot. They are tagged as enemy though, so they will kill me if I bump into one. There we go. So they're working, they just don't move, and they never disappear either. So that's where the next bit of script comes in. We're going to make these bullets instantly shoot forwards when they're spawned. They're actually going to move to their right for reasons we'll go through. So we're going to need another bit of script. So in the scripts folder, I'm going to create another C# script, and I'm going to call this Projectile. So this is going to be the bit of code that forces a projectile to move. Fire that up. And this is going to need a few things as well. We do need the start and the update functions in this one because we're going to propel it at the start and we're going to update it over time. But there's a few things we need to know. We need to know the rigid body of this object. And we've played with that before in the player, so I'm just going to go ahead and do the exact same thing as we did in the player. So public rigid body 2D. I really should have done it with a capital. There we go. And let's call that my rigid body. And we're going to need to know how fast this object needs to be propelled. So let's call that firepower. Let's have a public float for firepower. And let's set a default of 4. And then we need to know, if we're going to make these bullets disappear, we need to know how long we want them to live. So let's give them a lifespan as well. Let's have a public float called lifespan. I'm assuming lifespan is one word. I might be wrong. So we're storing the rigid body object, we're remembering how fast we want this bullet to move, and we are remembering its lifespan. I think that's everything. That will be enough at least. In the start function, let's just get rid of this and this. In the start function, we just want to instantly propel the object forward. So the enemy, the auto fire script on the enemy, is responsible for positioning and rotating this bullet. So it's already in position, it's already facing the direction it needs to go. We just need to propel it along that. So we're going to access the rigid body, more specifically access its velocity, just as we do with the player. And we're going to make that equal the right facing direction of this object. So we're going to do transform.right multiplied by firepower. And that's just going to blast the bullet along its x-axis according to this firepower that we've given it. And there's a reason for using the right vector, and that's because in Unity, I've covered this near the start of the video, it's why my enemies have that little line to the right, why the player has it. In Unity, at 0 degrees, objects are facing to the right when you're in a 2D game. So we are using their facing direction, their right axis, as the forward vector. And that's what that code does. So that's the start function finished there. Just instantly propel this rigid body to the right based on firepower. That alone will actually simulate shooting. So I could go back to Unity, find my bullet prefab, make sure that's selected, and then add that script to it because currently it's not on there. So I've got the prefab selected. I'm going to drag the projectile script onto it, and I'm going to set this rigid body here just by dragging it in. Let's maybe collapse a few things down. There we go. Feel free to change the firepower and the lifespan, and I'm going to hit play. So every 2 seconds this will spawn a bullet and it's not going to move. Notice it's a bit erratic. There's good reason for that. You might have put your finger on it, and it's because the bullets are spawning inside the enemy, so they're instantly hitting the enemy and it's freaking the physics out a little bit. We are going to fix that, but let's just sort the lifespan first. So this update function is going to be responsible for killing the bullet when its lifespan is up. So we're going to affect its lifespan over time. So let's do lifespan equals lifespan minus time dot delta time. Very similar logic to how we do the timer in auto fire. So shot timer is shot timer minus rate of fire. Here we're doing lifespan is the lifespan minus the delta time. and that will tick it down in real time until it's all gone, which means we need a question there. We can say if lifespan is less than 0, that means its life is up, and we just want to destroy it. So we're going to destroy game object, and that will kill this bullet and all the scripts attached to it. And that's actually complete. So the script there, totally done. Auto fire and projectile, both fairly simple bits of code, considering how powerful they are. And let's have a look at that one. So hit play again. After 2 seconds, we get a bullet. 2 seconds later, that bullet goes, and it's replaced with another one because the rate of fire syncs up quite nicely with the lifespan of these bullets. Yeah, right. Let's just fix that issue we've got where the bullets are spawning inside. I mean, we're not going to change the spawn position. That is one way you could go with it. You could just make them spawn slightly outside of the object that fired them. What we're actually going to look at is a way to manipulate the physics system in this case. And we can use what's known as a layer to change the way that certain objects collide with each other. So we're going to go to this Layers tab. I've still got the bullet prefab selected. It doesn't really matter where you do this first of all. If we go to Layer and click Add Layer, the inspector will update and we get this big list, and we can put a bunch of extra layers in. There are already some there, but I'm going to make one for my enemies. So I'm going to make an enemy layer. When you're happy with that, you actually need to pick everything that you want this applied to. So I'm going to just tick through my enemies one at a time there. So I've got this enemy selected. I'm going to put it on the enemy layer. Get this enemy, put it on the enemy layer. And again, this is a good reason why prefabs are good. I could make an enemy prefab, set all of these things and just drag them in from the prefabs folder and not have to worry about changing the tag, changing the layer, adding these colliders and things like that every time. I would need to refine the path because every enemy is probably going to have a different path, but that's by the by for now. And then in the prefabs folder, I'm going to select this bullet. If you prefer to edit something on the stage, you can bring a prefab back in, and with it selected, make your changes. So I'm going to put it on the enemy layer, and then you can hit this apply button. When you're working on something that is a prefab, you can click apply, and that will update the prefab in your project panel as well. It's not necessary to do that. I could just get rid of that, and I could change it directly through the project panel instead. But notice we're already on the enemy layer because I just applied it from the scene view. Okay, so everything that is an enemy is now on the same layer. With that done, if I go Edit, Project Settings, and go to Physics 2D, we get this layer collision matrix, which is responsible for allowing objects to collide with others. And we can see here that we have enemy at the top and a load of tick boxes. So do we want enemies to collide with the default layer? Yes. Do we want them to collide with water? Yes, why not? But we don't want enemies to collide with other enemies. So I'm going to untick that box. Which now means that anything on the enemy layer cannot collide with another object on the same layer. And with that in place, the bullets will now shoot properly because they no longer instantly collide with the object that fired them. But if I just move into place, they'll still collide with me because I am not on the enemy layer.